Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Gaurav Bhalla, Senior Associate at Ahlawat Associates. Ahlawat Associates is a full-service firm which has multiple offices across India and is operating in virtually every sphere of law and which provides legal services to a variety of clients ranging from startups, mid-sized companies, and Fortune 500 companies as well. On a personal level, I am engaged in the IP, media, and entertainment, sports, as well as data privacy practice for the firm. This video is, of course, a part of the Gaming for Next Gen series by LawWiser. So, this is part two of the series pertaining to overview of fantasy sports in India. In the first video, of course, I've discussed what are fantasy sports, what is the potential for growth of fantasy sports in India, what are the major platforms operating in India, and the concepts of game of skill and game of chance. We'll of course be discussing the concept of game of skill in this video as well through judicial pronouncements. Uh, so let's start off with that. The adjudication, I would say, of fantasy sports in India um, started way back in 1957 when the Supreme Court of India, in the case of State of Bombay versus R.M.D. Chamarbaugwala, interpreted the term mere skill. Uh, so the court said that include games of mere skill include games which are mainly of skill, and even if there is an element of chance in the game, the games will be regarded as games of skill since the predominant element in the relevant games is that of skill and not of chance or let's say luck. The next case was, of course, this case of state of Andhra Pradesh versus case Satyanarayan, in which the court adjudicated on whether the game of rummy is a game of skill or a game of chance. Now, for those of you who are aware how rummy is played, so there are a set of cards that you have to make in your hand, and you have to also be aware of what cards have been thrown in the common pile. So it essentially involves a lot of amount of skill instead of just luck on your part. So the court again, going on this rationale, compared the game of rummy to other three card games which are being played by a number of users such as flush or brag, and the court eventually came to the conclusion that the game of rummy requires a certain amount of skill because the fall of cards have to be memorized, and the building up of the rummy in the hand requires considerable skill in holding and discarding the cards, and therefore the court held that rummy cannot be regarded as a game of chance, and in essence it is a game of skill. The next case is that of K.R. Lakshmanam versus State of Tamil Nadu and another, in which, of course, the Supreme Court followed the precedents laid out in the previous two cases discussed by me. And the court went on to hold that a game of chance, on the other hand, is basically gambling because in to summarize a game of chance, it's basically a payment of consideration for a chance to win a prize. So basically, you bet on something, and that's about it. You don't have to apply any mind or skill to it, and it's basically luck whether you win the prize money or not in a game of chance. Of course, on the other hand, in a game of skill, it is dependent on the player's knowledge, experience, and adroitness with respect to the particular sport. Further, the court also introduced a rationale for regulation of game of skill, and it accorded uh, the protection under Article 19(1)(g), which is a fundamental right under the Constitution, which provides for freedom to practice any profession, trade, or business. So the operation of gaming platforms were in fact accorded this fundamental right in this judgment, which was, I think, a major step for regulation of fantasy sports platforms in India. Uh, then in the next case, which was dealt by the Punjab and Haryana High Court, which is the case of Shri Varun Gumber versus Union Territory of Chandigarh and others. In this case, the issue was regarding the platform Dream 11, which is of course a popular platform in India in today's date, which is again a fantasy sports platform in the sphere of cricket. So in this case, the court held that Dream 11 is uh, a platform which involves a game of skill, because the participant has to assess the relative worth of each athlete or sports person that he or she is selecting against all the athletes or sports person which are available for selection among the various teams. And in addition to that, the user also has to study and keep himself or herself updated about the rules and regulations of the strength of an athlete or the weakness of an athlete. So a combination of all these factors were the reason that the court decided that the game of the platform of Dream 11 will be regarded as a game of skill and will and should be allowed to operate in India. This judgment was of course challenged in the Supreme Court of India, but the Supreme Court of India also came down to the conclusion that Dream 11 is essentially a game of skill and not a game of chance, and should be allowed to operate in India. In the next case, which was that of Ravindera Singh Choudhary versus Union of India, which was decided by the Rajasthan High Court. Again, the question of regulation of the Dream 11 came was risen was arose in this case. Now, in addition to according the fundamental right under Article 19(1)(g) of the Constitution, the court also highlighted that the regulation of fantasy sports platforms in India contributes majorly to the government revenue, not only, of course, through GST and income tax payments, but also through increased viewership and engagement by numerous users around the world. And accordingly, the court held that there's potential for the government to make a lot of revenue out of this, and this should be regulated to ensure that this industry is flourishes further than it currently is, of course. Lastly, I'll be discussing the case of Junglee Games and others versus State of Tamil Nadu, which was decided this year itself in 2021. So this case pertained to a law which was introduced by the Tamil Nadu government, which put a blanket ban on all forms of online gaming, including games of skill. Now, this statute was, of course, challenged in the Madras High Court, and Madras High Court came to the conclusion that the provision introduced for banning games of skill was ultra vires the Constitution of India, specifically, of course, the Article 19(1)(g), and the court quashed the amendment which brought about a ban to all forms of online gaming. The court also suggested the government to take steps in this position, since games of skills are no more regarded as betting or gambling, and it directed the government to basically take steps in the regulation towards regulation of fantasy sports in India. Lastly, I'll be discussing some recent developments which have taken place apart from, of course, judicial pronouncements. To start off, the Niti Aayog by the end of last year, which is December 2020, they released a draft for discussion, which was titled Guiding Principles for the Uniform National Level Regulation of Online Fantasy Sports Platforms in India. In this report, the Niti Aayog recommended that certain guidelines should be framed for fantasy sports platform, which ensure that there's proper governance, transparency is there. Of course, aspects of consumer protection and accountability are also taken into consideration. In addition to that, the ASCI, which is the Advertisement Standard Council of India, in February 2021, issued draft guidelines for advertising on digital media. Now, these guidelines prescribe some regulations for influencers to ensure that they give accurate and correct information regarding financial and other risks associated with online games that are portrayed to the customers, so that the customers are not deceived by malicious, let's say, advertisements, and the customers are aware what they're stepping into and the risks involved therein. Uh, Further, the Law Commission of India, in its 276th report, also recommended that skill-based games should be exempted from gambling. There were some recommendations which were laid down by the Law Commission in its report, which included that the Parliament should enact legislations on betting and gambling under entry 31 of list 1 of the 7th schedule of the Constitution of India, since such games are played over media. Now, a regulation, a national legislation through this entry of the union list is a bit of a stretch in my opinion, because entry 31 essentially contains legislations relating to posts and telegraphs, telephones, wireless broadcasting, and other like forms of communication. So to regulate online fantasy sports just because they're played over media is a bit of a stretch in my opinion. But it's good in a way that the Law Commission of India is recommending the central government to come up with a national legislation to regulate such games. Secondly, the Law Commission recommended that only operators which have a valid license should be able to operate in this sphere, and there should be an authority which should issue such licenses. Lastly, the Law Commission recommended that all betting and gambling transactions have to be linked with the Aadhaar or PAN card to ensure that the operator as well as the participant or the users are protected from ill effects of such platforms, and thereby there is transparency and supervision of the state in ensuring that the consumers are not deceived. The last development which took place in this sphere is quite a recent one, which is actually last month, where the Karnataka government brought an amendment in the Karnataka Police Act of 1963 to ban all forms of gambling in the state, including online gambling. Now, this amendment was challenged before the Karnataka High Court, and Karnataka High Court again imposed a stay on this amendment, saying that, of course, games of skill have been allowed in the past by various judgments, including the Supreme Court of India. So the court, in its stay, held that this amendment seems to be not in consonance with the prevailing law in India. So to conclude, I think there is no doubt that online fantasy sports, which have been considered a game of skill and are considered legal in India, there is potential for the government, for the users, as well as for the platforms to make revenue out of this, and there is potential for these platforms to uh, uh, basically contribute to the GDP in a big way. And that's why we're seeing a lot of fantasy sports platforms cropping up in India now. Uh, However, of course, the issue still remains that since betting, gambling, and sports law are listed under entry 34 of list 2 of the 7th schedule, it is essentially a state subject, and that's why we don't have a consensus in terms of regulation of online fantasy sports among various states in India. So it will be great if the central government comes out with a legislation which governs online fantasy sports so that it's harmonized across India. But yeah, there's no doubt that there's huge potential for regulation of such platforms in India. I hope you like this video, and thank you.